The top 3 ways to improve your photography on Photoshop. Actually, that's every other Photoshop video on YouTube. How about this? How to ruin your photography using too much Photoshop. Back in a sec. Hi, it's Michael. Welcome to my photography channel on YouTube, or welcome back if you've been here before. So today's topic is a little bit clickbaity based on the title and the intro I just gave you, but it is a serious issue that I've been dwelling on for quite some time. I also run a Facebook group called Automotive Photography Education, and where I posted this topic as a poll to see other people's reactions, and it scored quite well, so therefore I'm making a video. There was also a recent post on this group about a certain someone who asked a question about a job that he was quoting for, and he was laying out the specs of the job, saying that it's a few hours of shooting plus like double-digit hours of Photoshop and retouching. And I think that was the straw that broke the camel's back for me, and that gave me the incentive to make this video. It's a real imbalance in the ratio between the shooting part and the post-production, the retouching part. And I've known this all along, and I've seen the trend going this way, and it's something that I really feel passionately against. Mainly for the fact that I think most of the photo industry is going in this direction, where the photography part is becoming almost secondary to the retouching and the Photoshop, where almost the entire image heavily depends on retouching in Photoshop to make a good shot. And I completely disagree with that. So I'm here today to share with you the reasons why I think that's the case, and why I think you should focus more on the photography and less on the Photoshop. So what I'm going to do is go through the 3 main points that I want to make about why you should focus more on shooting and less on retouching. And then I'm going to dive into one real job that I shot recently, and explain to you exactly what I mean by that in a more practical term. Just one thing before we start, if you haven't subscribed yet, I would really appreciate you doing so. It would help my channel grow a lot on YouTube, and I believe the photography community here could benefit a lot from my 20+ years worth of professional commercial shooting. So thanks. So here we go. So the first point is probably the biggest one. If there's any takeaway from this entire video, this is it. And it's the elephant in the room because it's obvious to me, but in case you don't know, I will first, playing by the metaphor, introduce the elephant and then identify what it is. And that is, you're a photographer, right? Are you sure? Because here's where things get a little bit interesting. If there's so much dependence on Photoshop, are you even a photographer anymore? And in case you think, well, I'm really good at Photoshop, well then, how much of a photographer are you? And on top of that, if you are really good at Photoshop, you've probably spent most of your time learning that craft. And therefore, you don't have invested this equal amount of time in the photography part. Now, if I had to choose, I would choose to be a photographer any day, which means that I spend all of my time with the camera taking photographs. And I do as much as I possibly can with the camera, in camera, on set. And I'll leave the retouching to someone else who is specializing in that craft. The misconception nowadays is that people think that a good photographer is someone who can also do good Photoshop. And I don't know where that came from. In my line of work, especially, those are two very independent talents. Clients would hire me because I can execute the vision and the concepts in camera, get that part done as best as possible, and then transfer that data to a professional retoucher who can finish the job. But here's the key. You have to think that the retouching part is an enhancement or polishing of what I provide them. It is not the make or break point that depends so much on retouching to make a good image. I've already given that to them. It's kind of like garbage in, garbage out. If I provide a bad image to a retoucher, there's no way they can save it in any way. So that is super key. A good example is if you shoot fashion, for example. Would you ever dare to do the makeup on the talent as well? Of course not. You would hire a professional makeup artist for that, or do their hair, which requires a professional hairstylist. You would never dare to challenge these disciplines, and yet somehow the retouching seems automatically part of photography. It's not the case. They are separate things that require separate people to do if you do it at a certain level. Now, that's not to say that you don't need to know anything about retouching. Just like you don't need to know anything about makeup or hairstyling or even fashion styling if you were to think about wardrobe. You need to know just enough to know how the process works in those disciplines. Then you're fine. Then you can talk to those people and get a workflow together that's efficient. So for example, in retouching, you just need to know how that process works when dealing with a retoucher. There's a certain way things are done, and it's pretty much universal across the board if you've never worked with one before. But generally, the way it goes is if you shot a collection of images, say 10 images, for example, for a job, you would pick one from that batch that best represents the entire batch in terms of concept, colors, tones, subject matter, that kind of thing. Lighting is important as well. Use that as the reference, as the base. You work on that one first with the retoucher. You get it to about 90% done, and you approve it amongst yourselves with the client as well, if you have a client. And then once that is set, kind of in stone, then you can just copy and apply that look to the remainder of the images. That's how it works. With makeup, for example, you would work with a makeup artist to establish lighter makeup looks first, and then work progressively towards heavier and darker looks. And that's simply the basics of that process. If you go the other way around and you start off with a heavy, darker look, and then switch to a lighter one, that means that they have to completely wash the face and starts from scratch after the dark one is finished. But if you start with a lighter one, they can just build on top of that. So that saves time. It's just these little things that you just need to know, but you don't have to know all the nitty-gritties. So with Photoshop, for example, you don't have to know exactly how things are done. The more you know, the better, but as long as you know how to communicate with them and know how the process works to save time, that's it. Okay, so I might have gone off tangent a little bit. You may not shoot fashion. You may not be a professional photographer. You may not need to work with retouchers. I'm not saying it's a must, but say you want just to work on your own images in Photoshop. And does this apply to you? Yeah, it still does, because it's still fundamental to make the best image possible in camera. And that would save you later on in post-production. Like I said before, treat Photoshop like an enhancement tool, a polishing tool, a refinement tool, but it's not something that completely changes your lighting, for example. It can't be done. I've actually talked to and worked with the top retouching houses in the world who all say you cannot change lighting. That's it. Hard lighting is hard lighting, soft lighting is soft lighting. You can't mix the two or change one to the other. It just can't be done. And even if they tried, it would just look terrible. Which brings me to the second point. And the second point has to do with keeping it real. Now, of course, I would have to assume that most of you watching this are the type of photographer who wants to keep their images looking realistic. If you are the type of photographer who wants to Photoshop or retouch the images so much that they become this dreamy fantasy thing, that's fine. I have no problem with that. But I would say that's not the majority. The majority out there are probably wondering why their images don't look real anymore. And that is because mainly you've over photoshopped your work. So again, if you provide most of the work done in camera while you're shooting, the less Photoshop is required, and therefore the more real it will stay. Okay, the last point. This has to do with quality and efficiency. So I'm sure all of you have been on a photo shoot and have come up to a point where you've told yourself, oh, I'll fix that later in post. And my question to you is, should you? Should you blindingly just say that and deal with it later? Or should you fix it then and there while you're still shooting? So the main question is, how do I decide what to fix in camera versus what to fix in post? Now, I'm not saying you should fix everything in camera because some things are actually better to fix in post, but how do you decide between the two? So I always ask myself, which one of the two is easier to fix? Is it easier to fix in camera? Is it faster to fix in camera? Does it provide a better quality when you do it in camera? If the answer to those questions are yes, then I will definitely fix it in camera. But sometimes, on the other hand, you can't fix these things in camera, or it will take too long to fix in camera. Then you will have to rely on Photoshop to do the work. If I needed to tweak the color of something, of an object that I'm shooting, it's easier to do that in Photoshop. But if I needed to move something or reposition something, much better to do in camera. So I think every single question has a different answer while you're shooting. Every challenge is going to have a different set of demands and a different outcome. So, but you just have to ask yourself the same questions. Which one's easier? Which one's faster? Which one's better? Right? And then do it then. Because if you always blindingly dismiss these little fixes to later and not deal with it then and there, you will end up with a list of things that you need to fix in Photoshop. And that will eat into your retouching time, because you will have to go through this list and fix all these little things, which you could have done so easily while shooting, before you can even get to the fun and creative stuff in Photoshop. And that brings me to another point about retouching. Retouching, you may think that you're in the comfort of your home or your office in climate control with a jug of coffee next to you. You may be disillusioned that you can go on forever. But in reality, you know that time is finite per photo for retouching. You will end at a certain time. And you would much rather spend the quality of that time on useful things, productive things, creative things, than fixing problems that you could have dealt with while you were shooting. So I would say that you should spend your time more wisely in retouching, as opposed to fixing things that could have been easily fixed. So those are the three main things that I wanted to discuss to you today about the importance of in-camera versus Photoshop. Now let's deal with some samples that I've shot recently to show you exactly what I mean. So this first example comes from a series of images I did for Audi in Hong Kong for their Q series campaign, which is basically a 4-image job of all of their SUVs, basically. So the Q series. So we have the Q2 up here, the Q3, the Q5, and the Q7. These were the current models at the time. The Q3, as of now, has already been updated to a newer model. Probably the next one up is the Q5. So what we did was shooting these in different locations in Hong Kong within from beginning of the job, which is the day the job was awarded, until the final deadline for 4 images was 2 weeks, which left us very little time to pre-produce the job. We basically got the job on a Friday, and we shot 2 of these shots on the following Monday, 3 days later, and then the other 2 the next day, just to give enough room for retouching afterwards. So it was a pretty rushed job, so we had to choose locations that were easily accessible, that locations that would not run into problems that would kick us out of areas. And it was tough because getting these locations through proper channels, like usually if you had to get permission or you had to pay, it takes 2 weeks notice. Most management places or property management places or even government require this amount of time, and we simply didn't have that much time. So we had to find locations that were easily and publicly accessible, that allowed us to shoot for a few hours each without getting kicked out, because that's the last thing you want to happen. So we're going to focus on this image right here of the Q7, which is, just to zoom it up, is a seemingly simple shot. Now you might think that, why am I leaving so much background in these shots? And the reason for that is because the client wanted full cropping options after the fact for any type of media that they wanted to put it into. So it could have been a billboard, a bus shelter, a mobile device, a banner on a website. These actually appeared in all of those. So if you can imagine, a banner on a website would be this long, very skinny, wide, horizontal landscape type of format. And a bus shelter poster would be a vertical format. So we needed to shoot far enough back and give enough of this background for them to crop any way they wanted. Now, the only way to pull so far back and still provide enough resolution for them to crop, because once they crop, of course, they're throwing away a lot of information and resolution, is to shoot with a high enough megapixel camera. And this is one reason why such high megapixel cameras exist today, is for reasons like this, where cropping options are required from one single final image. And this is 100 megapixels. If you multiply 11603 by 8704, it's 101 megapixels from the Phase 1 IQ3 100. And if you go back to the finals, they're all shot that way, so they can crop vertically and horizontally, extreme horizontally for banners. And that's the main reason. So whenever you think that, you never need 100 megapixels, you never need 100 megapixels if that's your final crop. But if for commercial work, they have a multitude of crops to consider, and that's when a high resolution back comes really in handy. For example, for the billboards that they use, they basically cropped in very tight here. So if this is 100 megapixels, this area right here is probably only about 20, I would guess. And from that 20 megapixels, they had to blow it up to a huge billboard, which is, I'll just give you an example, looking like this. And you can see that they don't have that many megapixels to work with. If you shot this with a 50 or even a 30 megapixel camera, that's probably not gonna cut it. You never know. It's really tight. This is the final billboard format. So every single image was cropped in really tight for these, and still it held up. Okay, so let's go with this one first. Now, I just wanted to let you guys know that this image was pretty much, I tried to get as much as done in camera, hence the point of this video. But to show you exactly in practical terms what that is, first of all, let's talk about the lighting, because the lighting is a contrasty sunlight, which is what we wanted for all the shots. We were using ambient light because it's the most natural, and I think the client wanted that as well. So in this image, the car was actually there on the top of this little dirt mound, and the only things that were comped in were the sky, and not so much of it, just a little bit from a different shot, and the mountains in the background, because we literally moved the mountains for this shot because there was nothing beyond this ledge here, and we just wanted some shape. So while I was there on location, I just took a separate shot of the mountains from a slightly different angle. The mountains were there. It's just not right here. We just moved them over here from a separate shot. But everything else, the tree, the smoke, or the dust you see here, that was shot in camera. The car, it was set up exactly as is. Nothing was really changed. We did rotate the wheels, if I can zoom in, to 3-to-1. Now let's go 1-to-1. This is 100%. It did rotate the wheel, so we brought a car jack with us that was heavy duty enough to lift a 3-ton SUV, and spun the wheels by hand so that the logos, the full ring logos on the center caps were straight for both of them. You can see here, and there's a lot of overlap here between car prepping and shooting everything in camera. There's a lot of overlap, and I'm gonna do a separate video later on about prepping a car, because I think that's important as well. But just to get back on point for this one, the car was actually on 2 planks of wood, one in front of this wheel and one in front of this wheel, and the reason for that was just so that the bottom of the edge of the rim is visible. If you didn't have that plank of wood, this bottom part will sink underneath this ledge here, and we agreed that didn't look very good. So we only put the wood down for these 2 wheels that are closest to camera. The ones in the back we didn't really care about. They were not on the wood. It's just to raise it high enough just so they can see the bottom of the rim. And license plate, there was a showroom plate, which is basically the Audi Q7 badge, and we decided to keep it. What we usually do in these cases is that we will have showroom plates with us, and it's up to us to decide whether or not to put it on. We would stick it over the actual license plate. If the car is unregistered and there's no registered plate available for the car, there is still a backing plate made of plastic that's attached permanently to the front grille of the car, and that's permanent. You can't remove it. So keeping in line with doing as much as we can in camera, this is something we cannot remove in camera, in real life, because that backing plate is permanently stuck to the car. So the only choices we have is to actually put either a real license plate, if the car is registered, or a fake plate, which is the showroom plate you see here. If we wanted to remove this whole thing, the only way we can do it really is in post-production after that. But the clients wanted to keep the plate to show the name of the car. And when you pull back, you can't read it. But for the billboard, cropped in so tight, yeah, you can read it. So they just wanted that extra bit of identification there. Let's look at the glass. This is all real. Obviously, the car is clean. We cleaned it. That takes about half an hour to 45 minutes to clean the car. We didn't clean the entire car because this is only one shot of each car, so we didn't have to clean any parts that the camera did not see, which was the other side of the car. But all the glass needs to be cleaned, and there's a certain way of doing that quickly on set. We're not dealing with detailing the car. We're just cleaning it enough for the photography. So there's no CPO used. in this case because I personally don't think CPL does a really good job with glass, because some of the glass, like the rear and sometimes even the front for some cars, there's that wire inside for the heated windscreen and the rear screen, and that changes kind of funky. You can see the texture inside the tempered glass when that happens. When you turn the CPL, doesn't look good. You can never get rid of it. The headlights here will have an oily film look when you turn the CPL sometimes. That doesn't look good. So I generally don't use it. And if there are reflections, like these little ones here, that's great. That's fine. If there's really cloudy reflections or bad reflections from like a building or something, then I would actually prefer to just change the angle of the camera or the car or both while on set so I can get a better reflection. But I won't waste my time doing that in Photoshop later on, because you got a lot of details inside the car that you want to maintain, and it's going to be really tricky in post-production to maintain those details of the seats and whatever else inside the car, and while only working on the reflections. It's tough. So to maintain that realistic look, just do as much as you can in camera. These highlights you see here were done with strobe. The strobe did a lot more work, but we only chose to keep the highlights and a little bit of this glow that you see right in the middle here. That was partially done by strobe as well. I can show you the first shot, the base image that we worked with as the base layer in Photoshop, which was this image right here. And the sun only came out for about 5 minutes total, and that's not all at once. That's 5 minutes total. Maybe it'll come out 30 seconds one time, you know, a minute another time. It was that cloudy that day. So we had basically someone by the camera making sure that as soon as the clouds cleared, they can shoot as much as they can before the sun disappears again. And we were there for a total of about, I think, 4 hours or so. So that gives you a rough idea. There was a lot of waiting, but while we were waiting, we can still prep the car and whatnot. And this sun shot was crucial to give us the contrast that was needed to show all the detail and textures in the sheet metal. Because you can see there's a lot of fine details right here about this line and how this curves up with, gives you a diagonal line here, and these separations over here. You know, if you look at the shot without the sun, which is this one, yeah, you can still see these lines, but it's definitely not as clear and crisp as the sunlit one. And you might think, well, I can just light it with a strobe or a flash to get this look. And you probably can, but you also have to consider that the sun doesn't only light the car, it lights the entire scene. It lights the rocks in the foreground, it lights the trees in the background, it lights everything from the same angle. So you would have to light all of that, you know, with a flash as well, and you'll never get it quite right, because to get the same enough power to light this big area in the foreground, the flash has to be relatively close. But when you put the flash close, it's not going to give you the same type of light as if the sun was, you know, so far away up in the sky. It's not going to give you quite the same thing. And how are you going to light the trees from up above with a flash? Like, the flash has to be up here. I mean, unless you can get it up there, but it's probably pretty difficult. You can't light it from below because that gives it, it's a different direction. All the sunlight comes from one direction. But if you have to simulate that with a flash, it's, you still have to simulate the same direction as well, which is really hard. So just to give you another rundown of that dust cloud, we actually had a leaf blower with us to kick up some dirt, and we lit it with a strobe just to light it up a bit better, and then we can tone down exactly how much opacity we needed. And this is the one of the strobe images. The phase one is also a camera that has a leaf shutter, which is a shutter that's built in the lens. And if you guys know about leaf shutters, is that you can actually crank up the shutter speed to as high a setting, and in this case it was 1/800th of a second. It's not very fast, but it's fast enough to darken all the ambient light without affecting the exposure of the flash. So you can still keep the flash at a decent power setting, but darken everything else in the background that's not lit by the flash. This is done intentionally so that whatever the flash is lighting pops out even more. If you also had a bright background as well, that light will start fighting with the flashlight. In this case, with a darkened background, you can see what the flash is doing and what it's hitting a lot more clearly. And this is where the highlights were sifted out from the rims, from these little places, from the fender here, all these little things. And we lit this with a strobe from different angles, so we captured all the information that we could put together on later on in post. But at least we shot all this information as opposed to creating it out of nothing in Photoshop, because that's just guessing. When you do one good guess and another good guess, it's okay. But when you have to do a lot of guessing in Photoshop, like accumulatively, then the total of all of guesses in the end will actually start to turn your image into something that looks a little bit off. And if you ever wondered why your image looked a little bit off, this is probably why, because you guessed too much. And, even though each guess was a decent, good guess, it all adds up. That little margin of error in each guess adds up in the end. But if you shot everything live, then there is no guessing because you shot it. So that's the first example. One more thing. This flashlight also does another thing, and it is to light the car cleanly without seeing any reflections. And that's another reason why I don't use a CPL, is because I can actually do the same look, and probably even better, with a flash. So what you do is that if you light the car from a certain angle, and the light's over on this side, skimming the car from right to left, you can just light up the car very cleanly, and you don't see any reflections in the sheet metal. And what you can do is layer this on top of your main shot, the regular no flash exposure, and then you can adjust how much reflections that you want using this combined with the other shot with reflections in it. Then you can control or reduce reflections as opposed to painting over this to remove your reflections, which never looks good. So that's this image right here. So you can see that we kept some of the real reflections from the original shot, but then we also had some clean ones from the strobe shot in the end. And that's this example. Let's move on to the next one. Now here's the Q8, which came out after the other cars that you just saw. So that's why it's not included in that set, but we did a separate launch for this car alone. So it's 5 images total, 1-day shoot with talent as well. And the launch color was this orange, which is a global launch color. So in every market that they launched a car in, they had to use the same color of car. So the color was kind of important. And we chose a location that specifically had some colors that were closely associated with this car. So for example, in these shots here, the buildings had this kind of a red wood that we tuned slightly to make it a bit more orange just to match the car. The ground actually had some orange-ish tiles, especially the ones that were reflecting the brick. So we just enhanced that to make some sort of connection between the car color and things in the surrounding area. The people were deliberately dressed in a neutral color so that they don't stand out very much and they don't fight with the car in any way. So the most saturated color remains as the car. The people there are there as an accessory. That's why you don't recognize their faces. It's just more of a subtle lifestyle flair addition. On top of all of this, there's an effect that we wanted to do, is to shoot through glass. So if this shot and this shot, we actually shot from inside, looking out through glass. And the remaining 3 shots here, here, and here, which were shot outside, we had to simulate that look. So we had to give it some sort of a glass effect as well, just to tie all 5 images together consistently at the end when you look at it as a whole. So these 3 images here, we had post-production do some sort of a reflection effect, and the effect was just other images that were thrown in and laid on top around the car. We didn't really want it to fight with the car and overlay the car, but just keep it around in a kind of subtle way. So that's the look. So what we're going to do is look at this image here, which is the final shot, and just give you, I just wanted to point out a couple of things for this one. The lighting and the setting and everything was pretty much good to go when we got there. We just had to clean up a few things. We didn't have to do a lot in camera to get this shot because we had pre-calculated the sun position beforehand. I knew exactly when to be at this spot, shooting the car from which angle, positioning the car as a rear 3/4, and I knew that the sun would cast a shadow from this building that would go this way. So I already knew all that, and once I arrived, they had reserved a space for us. We didn't run the risk of getting kicked out or anything like that. There were no people around, so all that was good. Didn't have to do too much, except we wanted to wet the ground. We wanted that glistery ground. I thought it would look good with the sunlight hitting the wet ground, and that will give a kind of a shiny effect, and it will also bring out some of the orange in the tiles to match the car even better. So we actually had someone with a, let's see where it is, a hose. Like, we wet the ground for real, just to say that we did it in camera. This really something you cannot even do in post production, to wet the ground. It just, I don't even know how you can do that. But so we do it in camera with a hose, and it takes 5-10 minutes to do, and then you shoot quickly because in this heat, the water evaporates really quickly, so it doesn't give you much time to shoot. The other thing I wanted to point out is the bracketing, because we didn't point that out in the beginning in the first example. But this is the bracketing sequence. Again, you're on a tripod, and you bracket for the brightest highlights. So you can get it down so that the highlights are this small, which is already pretty good. You can never really get the highlights to disappear, especially sun highlights, because they're just so bright. You can never really get this to go darker. You can get the specular highlight to get smaller and smaller, but it won't really disappear. There's no exposure to make it disappear, but you can get it small enough so that you have more room to work in post. So you get it from this spot, a bit brighter, and then bright enough all the way so that the darkest shadows of the tires and underneath the car, they're all visible, and these details here in the grille, all that stuff is visible. And then your dynamic range is set. You've got plenty to choose from at that point. You don't have to boost your shadows or recover your highlights. That's all there, shot natively, because I always think that if you boost shadows, for example, or recover highlights, it never really looks as good as a real exposure. I don't think the software can really do it as well as the real thing. Okay, another thing I wanted to show is this the rear of the car right here. In the base shot, I'll go back to the brackets, which is this one here. I didn't mind the organic reflections and the shadows on the side of the car. I thought that just looked normal, but I did not like so much the reflections back here. I thought they were a bit messy, a bit too much, and you could start to see some buildings reflecting off this black shiny piece, and I thought that was too much because it's interacting with the logo, and I thought this would be it would just be too much to retouch out later on. The black plastic, which is matte down here, is fine because it's not subject to reflections. It's just the shiny bits. The chrome of the Q8 badge will need to be nice and clean afterwards as well. So instead of using a flash like I did in the Q7 shot previously, another way to reduce reflections without using a CPL is to bring in a reflector to reflect a nice clean reflection as opposed to what the actual reflection is. And what that looks like is this. So I have my assistant here standing with my reflector, which is a California Sunbounce contraption. It's a decent size. It's not really 4x8. It's more like 3x6, I would say, feet. And that reflects a nice clean reflection. You can see the 55 TFSI logo, very nice and clean because that's chrome. And then this part's all clean, so you can use that as a layer in post. And then I did another one for this side as well. And I did another one in between too for the Audi badge, but you can't see it. But you can see the Q8 is, and this part right here is nice and clean. So that translated to the final shot like this. And you can see that the chrome of the Audi badge is nice and clean, and we just minimized the building. We didn't get rid of it completely because that would look a little fake with just a nice clean black here. But we kept it, darkened it, but this chrome came directly from that reflector. And that's it. Oh, and we also fixed this shadow here because in the previous shot we had some posts, lamp posts here. I will just show you. Go back to this one here. Street lamp here and another part of a building here. We retouched that out. We can't obviously remove this. And this was casting a shadow right here on the ground, so we removed that as well. And we just drew a much straighter line using this as the base and just continuing out here for a much cleaner shadow. And that's it for this shot. We also kind of filled in some of the holes in the trees in the background and maybe move this one shorter just so that the tree line, I always like the tree line to have a more flowing shape instead of this. So that's not hard to retouch. And obviously you can't do that in real life. Again, final shot with a nice smoother tree line, smoother shadow, no street lamp, and that's it. One final thought. You may wonder why I became so obsessed and fanatical about these little details of shooting everything in camera. And I think it comes down to the way I learned photography. I started in the days of film. So that means no Photoshop, no internet, and everything was dependent on your ability to capture the final image in camera. And I learned from school and also, more importantly, beyond school, assisting professional photographers in my hometown in Canada. And it's not just from one person, it's from many different photographers that I assisted for, where they all shared the same fanatical obsession about getting things right in camera because there was no choice. There was no backup of Photoshop to save you. So every little piece of dust and color correction all was done in camera. And I think over the years that was ingrained into me, and that is why I still feel that it's so necessary nowadays, because nowadays I've seen the trend swing completely the other way, where so little depends on that and so much is relied upon post-production. But I can also tell you that the clients don't want you to rely too much on post-production. When they're on set with you, the last thing that they want to hear is, we'll fix it later in Photoshop. They want to leave that set confident that you've got the shot. And the only way that they can feel confident that you got the shot is you got the shot pretty much there in camera, so they can go home and sleep easily that night. If a lot of thing is still left up in the air because you'll fix it later, they're not going to be too comfortable with that. So that's a good thought to finish off with. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to see more, please again subscribe, throw up a thumbs up down below, and also ask any questions that you have about this video in the comments section below, and I'll be happy to answer them. Thanks again. I'll see you soon.